So, you know, I'm a New Yorker. I'm fascinated by New York politics. And sometimes I talk to a friend of mine who's an expert on New York politics, more than an expert. He ran campaigns and he was a right-hand man of Michael Bloomberg, has been in politics a long time. Now he runs a bookstore and writes books. And the thing about friendship in 2025...
I do other stuff too. I don't just...
Yeah, I know. But the thing about friendship in 2025 is if you have a podcast, your friend probably has a podcast. So when I say I talk to Bradley Tusk about politics, I pretty much do it on podcasts, which is what we're doing now. Hello, Bradley. Welcome back to The Gist. Thanks for being my pal and talking politics with me today.
A few quick things around that. So one is, it is so funny how, because I listen to your podcast, either you kind of keep up with someone, but through their podcast, but also... if you meet someone, so like I had dinner with Derek Thompson maybe a month or two ago, and I love his podcast, but I'd never met him before. And it did feel like a little surreal, right? To be like, because you think you're friends with these people, they have no idea you exist, but because they're sort of like the intimacy between the listener and the podcaster is just different than any other form of media. And so,
but I'll tell you, the weird one for me is with you. We're talking like we've always talked, or how I expect to hear you.
For the listeners, Mike and I have known each other since 1989.
Yes, high school students. But if I were to meet a Derek Thompson or especially a Matt Iglesias, which I have,
Matt was my intern.
Why are they talking so
office.
slow? I listen at 1.5 speed, so it really wrecks it for me.
Oh, that really screws you up. Yeah,
I actually listen at 2.5.
Matt was my intern when I worked for Chuck, and I knew he was destined for greater things, and he did.
Yeah, he's way too smart. So we could talk about the abundance agenda, but first let's go local.
Sure.
New York mayoral race.
Yeah.
We have 9 candidates. 2 of them have the initial ZM. That is unfathomable to me. So you've been doing these events at your bookstore, P&T Knitwear, with City and State, and you've interviewed how many have
probably
had
6 or 7. I think tomorrow is Lander. I think Zellner's this week too. Cuomo's coming up at some point. So we'll be just about done with everyone in the next 2 weeks.
What's the Cuomo negotiation like? Harder than the rest?
Yeah, as you can imagine. But I do think it will happen.
What are you trying to get at that they aren't in all the other fora that they're doing?
Well, I mean, to me, I'm not a journalist, right? Like, yes, I have a podcast. But I'm not a journalist. And so my goal is not to grill them. Like, one of the ZMs, Zoran Mandami, was on the podcast, and I don't agree with him on pretty much anything. But my view was like, look, man, I want to give you a forum to get your vision out there for how you would govern this city, what you would do specifically, how you'd go about it. And I just try to use, having worked in and around city governments for a couple of decades now, my knowledge of all of it to just try to guide the conversation in ways that A, pushes them in tangible, directions, and then B, because most of the forums tend to be very community and group focused and therefore very left wing. And yet there's this huge cognitive dissonance right now where the voters writ large, or the residents writ large, when you look at the polling, and I've just seen a ton of polling, and then the very narrow groups of people who tend to really be involved in local politics, the voters writ large very much are upset about the city feeling dirty and dangerous, and they want someone that's going to clean it up, which is why Cuomo was way ahead. And yet the very, very small groups tend to be ultra progressive, and they don't believe in things like law enforcement or incarceration or whatever it is. And so I think a lot of the times these community forums are really getting at the same handful of issues that a very small group of voters care about. And the other thing I've tried to do on my podcast with the candidates is say, like, okay, will you keep Jesse Tisch's police commissioner? Do you think New York City should run its own subways? What are you going to do about the illegal weed shops? What are you about the scaffolding? Like the kind of stuff that I think most people actually care about.
Yeah, scaffolding. If polled on scaffolding, that would be the number one or two issue.
I polled it, and it's about 80-20. And then we actually did pass a law. We worked on it out of my foundation in late March that will hopefully over time meaningfully change it. So the law did a few things. One is it meaningfully increases the amount of time between mandated inspections. 2, it really reduces the amount of time that you're allowed to have the scaffolding up. And then 3, it has, at least in the law, real enforcement of that. So if you have, right now, a lot of people leave the scaffolding up because it's actually cheaper than taking it up and down. But if the fines are big enough, then all of a sudden you will comply with the law. So my hope is that that will largely solve the problem.
So I sense, and I've seen some polling, that the public is not excited, but it mostly shows up as not even being terribly aware that there is a mayor race upon us. And this is because the normal calendar of elections, we think about these things after Memorial Day and we think about these things in the fall. But the elections that matter in a big Democratic city like New York are the primaries. And so that's in June. That's how it is. You've done more about primary reform, which might be my number one political reform issue than anyone I know. But the public isn't terribly interested. Having met almost all the candidates one-on-one, are you more sanguine about the prospects or the crop
That's a great question.
than the average voter?
Yeah, a little bit. Hugo, my producer, is sitting next to me, so I'm kind of looking at him. I think that we have sort of generally agreed that they were all a little more impressive than we expected coming in. Now, that may just be that they were briefed enough to tell me what I want to hear, and that, they're good talkers because you don't.
Yeah, they could code switch. They know who you are. They know your audience. Yeah.
So some of that, but overall, I have found them to be a little more informed than you would think. But the problem is, and we saw this with de Blasio and we saw this with Eric Adams, it's very hard to go from never managing anyone or anything to running the biggest city in America, the most important city in the world, a budget of well over $100 billion, a workforce of over 300,000 people, if you don't know what you're doing, right? And a lot of the people who have come through are smart, and some of them are even thoughtful. And it's not that they don't want to do a good job, whether or not I agree with their particular views on any given issue. But I think the question is, do they have the ability to do it? And to me, there's really one key thing, and I've tried to ask everyone about this. I actually thought that Jim Walden, not that he has any chance of winning, but gave the best answer, which is, who are you going to hire, right? Because ultimately, as you said, I worked for Mike Bloomberg. I ran one of his campaigns for mayor. And the reason why Mike was a really successful mayor, was he the smartest guy in the room? Yeah, he probably was, right? But it wasn't really that. It's that Mike just understood, because he had built this incredible business, that the way that you succeed is you hire the most talented people you can get. And he didn't care about politics. He didn't really even care that much about diversity. He just wanted the most talented people he can get. And then he actually let them do their jobs and come up with big ideas. And as a result, really great things happened. And so whichever mayor has the ability to recruit and attract that kind of talent and also be willing to hire them, right? Like Eric Adams, you had to go to high school with him in order to get a top job in many ways. Or Bill de Blasio, you had to live in Park Slope and drive a Subaru and whatever, So if you can let all of that go and just attract and hire talent, then I think you had a decent shot at being successful.
Yeah. So for Eric Adams, all right, little divergence here. First question I want you to answer is, confirm he has almost no shot of winning. He's not running as a Democrat. Second question is, I think of the Churchill quote about America, they could be relied upon to do the right thing after they've exhausted all the possibilities. He somehow has backed into Jessica Tisch as NYPD commissioner, and she was this great sanitation commissioner, and you're asking everyone, will you keep her? Yeah. How did he luck into that?
She was there, and she is truly, I only know her a little bit, but we haven't overlapped much, but is truly a dedicated public servant. Obviously, her family is incredibly wealthy, so she has the ability to do anything she wants or nothing at all. And she has dedicated her life to city government and public service. And also, in a way, because she has that independence and freedom, she is able to really approach the job in a way that most people who either came up through the system or are thinking about their job after being commissioner can't really do. So she has rooted out a lot of corruption. She has changed a lot of processes. She has changed the structure. Now, the commissioner directly before her, Caban, was horribly incompetent and corrupt, and I'm amazed he hasn't been indicted yet. So the disparity there is huge. But overall, she was there and she wanted to do it. And look, if she succeeds, and I think what's interesting, and I don't know if she quite realizes this or not, but we were talking about this earlier, which is success will be both based on reality and perception, right? So she is going to tout, hey, look, it's the stats, grand larceny is down, robbery, rape is down, whatever it is. And that very well may be true. If the city still feels bad, it doesn't really resonate. And so even though in some ways her job is not quality of life, I think, especially because she was sanitation commissioner, she should understand this. She really has to lean into both, because if she can do that, then one day if she does run for mayor, people will remember her tenure as successful. Right now, I think they would say, if they've heard anything about her, oh yeah, she sounds smart, she's doing some stuff. Are you happy with New York City right now? No. And so she still has to overcome that.
Yeah. And Adams, no chance from what your polling shows?
No. I mean, I don't really see, the reelect. So one of the things that you always ask people is just voters, do you want to reelect the incumbent, right? Traditionally, historically, you had to be at least 50 to get reelected. That number, like everything, has fallen a bit over the past decade or so, but he was at 12.
Yeah. The baseline rule of thumb is no longer 50. We just don't have that with politics anymore.
He was at 12. I've never seen a number that low. So no, I don't think he has any chance whatsoever. By the way, I'm not even sure he really runs. I think his next job is something in the federal government for Donald Trump. And so if Trump tells him to run, he'll run. If Trump says, I don't give a shit, then I think he might not.
Oh, that's a great state of affairs. So I want to get to the Cuomo-ness of it all. But first, let's talk about crime. I think that I'm one who looks at the stats, and I'm one who I know that perception is reality, but also, and perception lags reality, but reality does influence perception. And when murder spiked after COVID for a lot of reasons, but a lot of it was policing pullback and some of it was, pent up emotion. But there really was a murder spike, and that really did lead to bad feelings. And we're probably still experiencing that. But now I especially look at homicide stats. They're getting better and better, and the other stats are getting better and better. Maybe once there is a new mayor and it's not all associated with the inherently criminal Eric Adams, things will change. Is that how you think it will go?
Yes and no. So yes, perception, there's no issue more than public safety where perception and reality intersect and shape each other. However, even in our worst years, in those Dinkins years, we were still at 1,500 murders in a city of 8.5 million people. So basically, neither you nor anyone you're ever going to meet is likely to get murdered, right? So yes, if murder is bad, people are aware of that and they don't like it. But the problem is, and this is where really Adams has failed so far, some of the stats are down since he took over, but they're sort of counting stats. And when you walk down the street and there's someone fucked up on fentanyl or trank, and they're acting crazy, or you're on the subway platform and there's a guy with his pants down literally pooping or whatever it is, I hope you might have to edit this out, but I have never smelled human shit at the level that I have in the past year or two on the New York City subway platforms, right? And it is just disgusting. And so when the city feels that way, the stats don't really matter. And look, I get it. I mean, you can argue that Adams has had bad luck in the sense that, if you think about the 90s, Giuliani in some way benefited from the fact that the street drug of choice at the time was heroin. It went from crack, which made people nuts, to heroin, which made people very sedate. And as a result, it just made them less threatening, which kind of helped overall with what he was trying to do. Whatever the fuck fentanyl does, it really screws people up. And so you just have this world where you walk down the street or you get on the subway and there's a decent shot that someone scary will be there. There's a pretty low chance that something's going to happen to you, but you don't feel that way. And that's the problem.
Right. You're right. The West Coast, all these West Coast cities that much more than New York went into drug legalization and decriminalization, they have the problem tenfold, but in a packed urban environment. Just the idea of the proximity to feces and defecation, it kind of short circuits all of our other calculus.
Right. So I've been spending a lot of time in LA, and I really, really like LA. And I accidentally drove through Skid Row, and I was like, holy fuck, because there's nothing in New York nearly as bad as that. Right. But the rest of the time, you don't really intersect with it all that much, right? At least in the nice neighborhoods that I tended to either be staying in or going to meetings in. And as a result, you're able to separate the things out, whereas because we all get around on the subway, we all get around on the streets, and it's in your face. That's part of what makes New York so amazing, is that sort of density and interaction and vitality. But when it also feels really bad, it impacts everyone. So you can't kind of segregate it in the same way.
By the way, what is the actual Mamdani plan for using the subways to house the homeless? Not the cartoon version of that?
He wants to take, I think this was a terrible idea. He wants it, there's a lot of empty retail space at some of the
Like
stations.
kiosks, right.
Yeah, or even like, if you're like Times Square, Columbus Circle, he wants to turn those into service. If I'm, because I've interviewed a lot of candidates, I believe this was his idea. I might be now giving him credit for somebody else's idea. But I believe that it was his, and he wants to turn those spaces into service areas, which, by the way, fine. Like that,
yeah,
no problem. But it's funny.
But wait, was the big problem that there wasn't the geography to actually give out the services, and we need an
No, I mean, the problem with Miami in
kiosk?
general, I had this debate with my daughter yesterday who got home from college and wants to canvas for him, is, she said, well, he has all these great ideas. And I said, sure, but his ideas are just free stuff. She's like, yeah. And I said, but how's he going to pay for it? And that was beyond her. And then I said, look, in theory, every candidate could just promise free stuff. To the credit of the rest of them, they're actually responsible enough to not do that, right? So, it's easy to promise free stuff. It's hard to execute on it. And the reality is, like, could you find the money for it? Sure. But you'd have to cut, a lot of sacred cows, because the reality is he would just say, well, there's a lot of rich people in New York, so they can just pay for it. But it's not completely elastic, right? Like, ultimately, a lot of people do move to Florida or other places. And if you have a combination of shitty quality of life, in part driven by really progressive policies around criminal justice that people like Mamdani have, combined with taxes that are too high, people leave, right? And so ultimately, sure, if you were willing to say, we spent $40 billion on education and we could probably find $10 billion of waste in administration, just fire lots of people, sure. Is he willing to take on the teachers union and do that? Probably not. So, I'll be impressed with someone with his views when they're willing to show me how they can get the money, not by just sort of claiming that they're going to raise taxes and no one's ever going to bother to leave, but show me how you're going to take on sort of the sacred cows of the left and actually do it.
All right. So I promise Cuomo's still looming out there in our conversation and in the race, but I want to follow up. Mamdani, is he second? Is he?
Yeah.
He's exciting. He's very vibesy.
He's
vibrant.
Podcast,
he's raising money individually. How strong is the candidacy?
He was super dynamic and likable and talented. Like, just in terms of, like, if you said to me, who's the best political athlete that we've interviewed so far, it's definitely Mamdani, right? Like, not even close. Cuomo, obviously, you can't get elected statewide that many times and not be good. So we'll see. He outshines him. But overall, Mamdani's not only in second. Look, if you want, I can paint a somewhat compelling argument for how Cuomo loses, although I don't believe it. But the thing for Mamdani is really, would he run in the general on the Working Families Party line, of which he doesn't really have a chance of getting much more than, call it 17 to 20% most likely. But if you're him, and it's a way to just kind of keep raising awareness, because look, if AOC primary Schumer in 28 or runs for president or something else, he is a very good potential candidate to take her congressional seat.
Yeah. So you're saying that if he has a path to the mayoralty, it is not through.
No, I don't think he has one. I'm just
primary?
saying I think that politically, I'll paint you the one where I guess he could have it. But ultimately, what I'm saying is that if the likely scenario is that he comes in second, he could still choose to run in the general election on the Working Families Party line if they give it to him. And he wouldn't win the general election either, but he can keep his name out there for a few more months and kind of keep impressing people like my daughter and just kind of keep paving the way for a future run for something. The way he would lose would be some combination of, like, and maybe this gets us into the Cuomo part of it, but, like, fundamentally, there's really one threshold question when you look at the polling that matters, which is, so right now, roughly 40% of respondents say Cuomo, right? And by the way, the ranked choice system, like that, even because he's got second place for a bunch more people. There's one of two things.
Oh, you're saying he's people's strong second choice and people's strong first choice?
Some people's second choice and a lot of people's first choice. And some people hate him, right? There's all kinds of possibilities. But if you believe, as sort of the other candidates insist, that the people saying Cuomo right now have forgotten about the nursing home scandal, forgotten about the sexual harassment scandal, forgotten about all of his negatives. And once they're reminded of it in paid media, they will change their mind. Then potentially we got a real race here. If you believe that it's all baked in and they're aware of all of it, but their view is, fuck it, yeah, might be an asshole, but he's our asshole. And in a time where the city feels really bad, and in a time of Trump, although it's sort of a fiction that the idea that the mayor is needed to balance out Trump one way or another, but putting that aside, but in that situation, it's fine that he's like that because that's actually what we need. I believe that's the reality of it, which is that people are fully aware of him, good and bad, and it's all baked in. But if it's not, then if you combine that with, let's say, the Working Families Party convinced Lander and Adrian Adams and Stringer and everyone else to basically throw their support to Mondami, and all of the money spent was basically negative on Cuomo with the exception of Mondami running his own positive, then maybe, and Cuomo commits some more unforced errors, and maybe the New York Times reverses its policy at the last minute and does an endorsement and it's Mondami, maybe all of those things combined could somehow do something, but, those are a lot of different, permutations now.
So here is my thought with Cuomo. We could talk politics and we could talk policy. I get the feeling, I hate to say it's just a feeling, it's ineffable, that were he to be elected, were he to win, it would be the strangest thing because this is a guy in absolute need of a comeback. He was laid low and he had hit a nadir. And usually, or actually every single other time, there are different ways to do it, but you either ask the public's forgiveness or the public at least considers all that you've done wrong. Some accept, some don't. Maybe you reframe things, but there is an active engagement in terms of acknowledging all that was done wrong. And then there are different paths forward for different voters to forgive, forget, whatever. You take Trump, you take Jerry Brown, you take Richard Nixon. We could talk about people on the local level. This is how it's done. There is a reckoning. And in this race, none of that is going on as far as I could tell. Cuomo's back and he's like, hey, remember me? Was I really that bad? But he's not even saying that. He's just number one in the polls. Am I misapprehending what's happening?
I think the variable that you didn't include in your analysis is there are periods where the situation specifically, the context, the zeitgeist, whatever you want to call it, is so specific that it allows for an exception to what you're talking about, right? So where city government, I've worked in city government, state government, federal government, and the distinction is massive in that city government is the most tangible binary, type of government by far. And people kind of expect things to be run well enough that they feel safe, that they feel like it's clean, that they feel like the schools are good enough to send their kids to and all of that. And when they don't feel that way, they're really willing to overlook a tremendous amount, right? And forget about Cuomo's specific flaws. Giuliani in 93 and then reelected in 97, Bloomberg in 01, 05, and 09, Republicans in a city that has 7 or 8 to 1 registration advantage for Democrats, when the city felt because of super high crime and murders and everything else in 93 or 9/11 in 2001, really dangerous. People are like, fuck it, I don't care. I'm voting for this guy because it seems like he'll actually keep us safe or he knows what to do. And so I just think the combination of city government is different and the specific context where everything just feels really bad is different. And because Cuomo is seen as someone Trumpian, that is playing to his benefit. Now, again, like I said, there really aren't in reality that many times where the mayor of New York City is directly pitted against the president where it's a fair fight anywhere where like the mayor's ability to push back matters. But the perception is that it matters, and all the candidates keep talking about Trump, so therefore they've made it matter. And Cuomo sort of lines up the best. Like I'll give you another example. So my brother-in-law is running for governor of New Jersey. Their primary is on June 10th. His name is Josh Gottheimer. And Josh is the true moderate and centrist in the race. He created this thing called the Problem Solvers Caucus in the House, which is one of the only real bipartisan groups left. He helped get infrastructure done. He helped get a policing bill done. He's done actually a really good job considering the state of the government that we have. And his plan for the campaign was to talk mainly about sort of taxes and the economy and kind of contrast himself with the far left candidates. And he's doing some of that. But a lot of his ads now, if you've seen like the boxing one, for example, are all about Trump simply because that's where the zeitgeist of the race is. That's where everyone's attention is. And you just had to engage.
So another interesting thing about Cuomo is that he has two scandals, one, the sexual harassment scandal, and one, the nursing home scandal. They have different political valences in terms of who would object to them most. The right, conservatives, which are very few in the city, look at the nursing home scandal and they find it horrible. But they also might look at the sexual harassment scandal and find him just to be a victim of the overly woke. I don't know how much that plays into the idea, that we saw a lot with Trump, where you would see the meme of Mr. Burns and all the different maladies inside him fighting each other, thus making Mr. Burns a healthy figure. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing to think about. But the other thing is, and I'll just ask you, how big a scandal should the nursing home scandal have been?
It's hard to say, right? Because on one hand, I think the scandal, to me, if there is one, is much less around the decision that he made. Because look, we were in a global pandemic. Nobody really understood what we were dealing with at the time. And I think in large part, he doesn't want to say this right now, but the decision they made, which isn't crazy, is people who are really old should not be prioritized for hospital beds over people who are younger. And we have limited amount of capacity. We don't know what this thing is. And so we should try to keep the older people where they are in the nursing homes and treat them there and reserve the hospital beds for people who are younger. Obviously, if that's your grandmother or your mom or it's you don't want to hear that. That policy in and of itself is not crazy at all. I think where they got into trouble was this notion that they really covered it up and and as there were a lot of deaths in nursing homes, because you combine people who are already old and sick with a pandemic that spreads, virally and quickly, that a lot of people are going to get it and they're going to die from it. So I think in the cover-up of that is really, if there's a scandal, where they managed to create it. Had they just been honest about the stats and not tried to make it seem otherwise, I'm not really sure there is a scandal. There's just a policy decision that you could agree or disagree with.
Yeah, that's probably true. So is it the truism that it's the cover-up, not the crime, or is it more?
I think so, but I also just say...
But then again, you could look at that and say, well, that's a process violation, not some moral
I don't
transgression.
see this. I mean, look, maybe if he ran for governor again, this would be a bigger issue. But I just, when I talk to real people and they tell me what they like or don't like about him, no one has ever brought up the nursing home scandal. The next one you're going to ask about, the sexual harassment stuff, very much so, right? Mm-hmm. So, and I know a lot of women who are absolutely just not going to vote for Andrew Cuomo no matter what, simply because of that. And I totally get that. So, but the nursing home thing is one of these things that, I don't think it's a real issue in terms of being an electoral issue in 6 weeks.
Yeah. There are two parts of the 11 accusers or 12 accusers, however you count them. Many of those accusers, when you read, and I've read actually all the transcripts, they don't amount to much. I'm not being dismissive, but it could be the interpretation of how eager Cuomo was to have someone from Rochester come to his an official event because she was, a pretty woman. There was not even any touching in many cases, or there was, I reflected on it years later and I realized that this behavior was inappropriate, or a hand on the back. So you could actually, if you go one by one, throw out a bunch of them as, okay, probably not the best way to act, certainly not the best way to act, but fireable. Then you have a couple that I think we'll never know the truth of, an aid up against the wall and a groping or touching of state troopers in really lascivious ways that I don't know if they disqualify you for mayor. I guess they don't.
They don't for president.
Right. That's true. I don't know if they disqualify you in the minds of most voters if you really look at them one by one, as opposed to just getting this general overall icky feeling. But my question is, does Cuomo actually have to address that? Or is it more I think some people
If you're
will never get
explaining
over
your-
that.
if you're
I think
explaining
some of
your
it is
losing,
bullshit,
there's
and I
no
think some
upside
of it
for
is
him.
I have a good case to make despite this.
Yeah, like I said, if you're explaining you're on defense, you're losing, right? Like there's no, for him to have to go through one by one and sort of dispute all of it, like that's already a disaster. And look, that's why he's running a real Rose Garden campaign, because one, his name recognition outweighs everyone else. Two, the zeitgeist of the moment fits his sort of skill set and the way he's perceived perfectly. Three, there's so much shit happening in the world right now, and Trump just dominates everything, and the Pope and so much else, that just no one's paying attention to the mayoral race at all. But also, like, he doesn't want to put himself in a position where he has to be explaining all of this. And so the reality is he's better off mainly not going to community forums and most debates and most podcasts and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Does the public lose?
The public loses when ultimately they don't have access to the candidates. But keep in mind, the public loses here because let's assume he wins or whoever wins, right? They're going to get between 250 and 300,000 votes in the primary. Do you know what percentage that is of the city's population as a whole?
I know. This is the worst.
About three to four,
Yeah.
right? So that's why we lose, because so few people actually participate in the decision-making process. Do you know what turnout was in the last New York City council primaries?
Yeah, it's 8%.
7.2. So you could win a council seat with 8,000 votes. We are the most successful city, biggest city in America, maybe in the world. And with 8,000 votes, you could win a council seat, right? So ultimately, the real crime here is that so few people participate that you get a mayor who frequently is totally unaligned with the values of the city as a whole. And as you've heard me talk about a million times before, the only way to solve this is to radically increase participation and turnout. And the only way to do that is to meet the voters where they are. And every one of us pretty much has a phone in our pocket. It's become a utility, not a luxury. And through my foundation, we have built technology that is secure, and I can walk you through how it works, that allows people to vote on their phones, that we are making open source and giving away to any government in the world that wants to use it. And ultimately, if we want more people participating in local elections and local primaries in order to reduce extremism and in order to make our candidates more reflective and responsive to the needs of the public as a whole, you've got to make voting a lot easier, and that's what mobile voting does.
Let me ask you this question about Cuomo. In your assessment, the idea about him that you have to have sharp elbows and you have to be a little bit of a bully to get things done, he likes that. It applies to him. How true is it? How much of an effective bully was he?
It's true for sure for being mayor. No question about it, right? It's not true in the notion of you needed to stand up to Trump. Like, there's just not that much real direct interaction in that way. But look, you have all of these institutions that benefit from the status quo. And if you want to make the schools better, you have to directly take on the UFT, the teachers union, right? And if you want to be able to make healthcare more accessible, you probably have to take on SEIU, although they're endorsing him, so I don't think he'll do that. Or if you want to be able to sort of make the city safer and cleaner, you're going to have to take on the far left, right? So 327 people commit about a third of the shoplifting in New York City. And the reason why they just keep doing it is the people who we elect as judges, because we're about like 4% turnout for judges, are the most left wing of the left wing who don't believe in law enforcement or incarceration or anything like that. And that's who they elect. So whether those people believe that too, or they just know they need to maintain that position to get reelected, they just won't jail people no matter how much they're shoplifting. And the problem is it's not a victimless crime for two reasons. One is really hurt stores. I would say the only good news about owning a bookstore is nobody steals books, but everyone else. And the sad thing is, when you go into CVS and you want toothpaste and you got to press a button and wait for some guy to come and unlock the case, you know what I do instead? And most people I know, they order it on Amazon, right?
Yeah.
And so you're ultimately contributing to the entire sort of, just destruction of the whole retail economy and storefront economy and empty storefronts and vacant places. And then that leads to more quality of life problems and more crime and more drug abuse and everything else. And so there's, significant negative externalities in not enforcing the laws around shoplifting. But if Andrew Cuomo tries to make that a really big issue, the far left is going to call him racist and fascist and all of these other things. And you need to have the balls to stand that down.
By the way, psychologically, the bookstore consumer, are they really buying books or are they buying the social signifier that I'm the kind of person who would own this book?
Well, first of all, not many of them are buying anything, at least from my bookstore. But
They're buying muffins, and you have excellent baked goods.
Look, I think that there are people who really love books and love to read paper books as opposed to Kindle. I think there are some people who probably like the status of sort of supporting a local indie bookstore. And so, look, once in a very blue moon, I will see someone carrying like a P&T knitwear, the same of our bookstore, tote bag, wearing a T-shirt, and I laugh because I'm very appreciative of their support. But I think about it. So the reason the store has this funny name, as you know, is well, my family, after World War II, my family survived the Holocaust, and then they were living in the refugee camps in Germany for about 5 years. And then finally a cousin sponsored them. This was my dad and my grandparents. And they came to the U.S., and my grandfather and another guy he knew from the DP camps, displaced person camps, opened up a 300-square-foot sweater store on Allen Street called P&T Knitwear. And my store is on Orchard between Houston and Stanton. And when I signed my lease, I texted my dad and said, hey, wasn't that original store right around here? And he told me the address. I'm like, oh, it's the next block over. And then I said, remind me the name. And he wrote back, P&T Knitwear, but you cannot name a bookstore P&T Knitwear. So the minute my dad told me I couldn't do it, of course, that was the name. And so the idea that my grandfather coming over, on a ship where they literally remember like seeing the Statue of Liberty and all of that and, having the true immigrant experience, that people would then be spending money to advertise the name of the place as a way to show that they, are virtuous in some way, I think would have tickled him to no end.
All right. I do want to ask you one or two bonus questions about abundance because it's in the air and it's exactly in your wheelhouse. But I know Ezra definitely agrees with it, and I know that Derek is really hot for it. And I hear Pete Buttigieg talking about it. He's absolutely the kind of guy who agrees down the line that the Democrats specifically have gummed up the works and made progress too hard.
Yep.
However, and you're exactly in that mold, a Democrat who is into tech and wants things done and understands.
I've actually been independent now for about 15 years, but yeah. So
okay.
Yeah.
I think you probably
otherwise
haven't voted Republican in the last few
I tend to vote Democrat. My money tends, if you were to look it up, my donations, they're 90-something% Democrat. But
yes,
I'm not.
Okay. So you want, if there's change to come, it's more from the Democratic side, and this is preaching to Democrats. However, my assessment is I get a little upset, especially when Pete Buttigieg, who I think signifies the kind of, let us call it a technocrat, but a very smart guy who correctly assesses all the roadblocks to progress. Mm-hmm. And where I'm upset is that while he agrees and while he might say and even think that he agrees that we need progress, he will never rank it as the number 1, 2, or 3 agenda items, I don't think. And I think many smart Democrats will say, yes, we need to cut through the bureaucracy. But when it comes time to do that, there are too many sacred cows. There are too many chivalries. There are too many unions. And that is why it's even more frustrating than if this were never put on the agenda in the first place. Well, I don't see how this could get done.
Well, a few things. So one is, it's not, and I've had conversations with people who are actually working on these issues and tried to make the case. They're like, oh, well, we have salons with members of Congress and an abundance caucus in the House. Like, none of that fucking matters because this is a state and local issue. And so Pete Buttigieg has, since he was 4 years old, had one goal in life, and that's to be president of the United States. And every single decision he makes is solely based on that calculation and nothing else. And because it's not a federal issue, he can sound smart on a podcast talking about it, and he might agree with it, and he's a smart guy, but it's not actually going to get him elected president. So, of course, he's not going to prioritize it. This is a question for city council members. This is a question for mayors, for state senators. And yeah, it gets back to, though, the underlying point, which is small groups of people have been able to sort of block housing and block construction that's affordable by putting their own sort of needs first, whether that is sort of excessive community review, excessive environmental review, or requiring union labor for everything. And as a result, nothing really gets built. But the reason why all of these people have disproportionate power in democratic politics is because we live in a world of 10% turnout, right? We live in a world where because of gerrymandering, only the primaries really matter. Primary turnout is typically around 10%. Those are usually the special interests or the most left-wing ideological voters, just like it's the most right-wing ideological voters and the special interests on the right in Republican primaries. And as a result, if you work on the basic assumption that every policy output is the result of a political input and every politician makes every decision solely based on winning the next election and nothing else, which has been my experience in 30 plus years of doing this stuff, then they're going to answer to whatever they need to answer to get reelected. So the abundance agenda itself can only win if the majority of people are now participating in the process. And that gets back to, my sort of underlying belief, which is until you find a way to radically increase turnout, you can't change anything else. And you do that by meeting the people where they are, which is on their phones, and letting them vote securely from their phones.
Yeah. How it would win practically is not to win as an abundance agenda. It would just, a good thing would get done and another good thing would get done. And the thing that would stop the good thing from getting done gets beaten back in a state house or in a city council. Yeah. That's how the abundance agenda.
Keep in mind, there are some people who are truly ideologues, but the vast majority of politicians, they would prefer to accomplish things than not. Right? Like, it's not that they like being told by a handful of special interests or, left-wing groups or right-wing groups, here's how you have to vote on everything. But they're never going to prioritize that ahead of winning their next election. So if all of a sudden the Carpenters Union or, Earth Justice or whoever it is goes from having, X amount of sway in a primary of 10% because their money goes a lot further to Y because turnout's now 40%, so all of a sudden, their influence gets cut by 3/4, then all of a sudden it's a lot easier to not listen to them and to vote for the thing that actually creates progress. Let's use when Amazon wanted to create their second headquarters in New York City and Queens, 200 plus cities competed for it. New York was one of the two winners. Everyone's super excited about it. If you look at the polling from both the city as a whole and a district, that's overwhelmingly the case. Then AOC comes out against it because for her politics, it's just all about her sort of narrative.
Not even her district.
Not even her district. And the state senator from Long Island City, Queens, named Mike Gianaris. And he's just a guy. He's not good. He's not evil. He's not conservative. He's not liberal. He's not anything, right? He is just a politician that wants to be in office, and that's it. And he said to himself, of course I want this, but if I support this deal now, it is possible I could get a primary. And if I get a primary, it will be from the left. And turnout will be historically around 10%. And the people who are the most left-wing in my district who vote in primaries hate Amazon and hate business and hate capitalism, hate technology and everything else. And they love AOC. And I could potentially lose. Now, he probably still would have won, but he didn't even want the risk. And he ultimately faced a choice. 40,000 new jobs for New Yorkers or one job, his own, and he picked himself. Right? And that's typically, in my experience, what politicians will do. So if creating 40,000 good-paying jobs with benefits is not the abundance agenda, I don't know what is. But it's not really a question about just building support for housing reform or zoning reform or permitting reform. It's just about empowering the majority over the will of the minority.
Yeah. By the way, is Amazon HQ2 in Virginia, is it doing gangbusters? What's the progress?
No, I think that actually, I know it exists. I have a friend who I had dinner with the other night, and she said her son's working there. I don't know that it has grown as much as they expected it to, but I also know that Amazon did overall grow gangbusters during COVID. And I know that despite not being able to put all the facilities in Long Island City that would have employed a lot of working class people, middle class people, Amazon has still put a lot of high end jobs in New York City in their offices in Hudson Yards or somewhere, simply because they need the talent for certain things.
Right, that's the other argument, that they're still building in New York and they're paying, they're not doing it with tax breaks, they're paying full freight.
But first of all, the tax breaks of I forget the number now. It was like $3 billion in potential tax credits. $2.5 billion of that was as of right, meaning if you and I created a company right now and we met the criteria, we would get that $2.5 billion.
Yeah. They wanted to redevelop that area, right. Just like literally where near the water it was being built. Yeah.
Right. And so should they have foregone the other $500 million? Yeah, absolutely. It was stupid and short-sighted. But overall, the problem is the jobs in Queens would have helped a lot of middle-class people who needed them. The jobs in Hudson Yards are for, your kids, my kids who are, when they're a little older, coming out of really good schools and they've got elite degrees and fancy educations and all of that. So, in theory, the people that progressives are supposed to want to help lost, and the people who they're supposed to hate won.
One last thing I want to ask you about the abundance agenda. Sure. You're right. Carpenters unions, Earth Justice, the groups get in the way. The high-minded, far-seeing Pete Buttigieg's or the local version. Well, I guess when he was mayor of South Bend and he was rehabbing the Studebaker plant, maybe he'd be in the group that would actually see things as they are. However, I also think that the high-minded narrative among the Derek Thompsons and the Ezra Kleins, the people who tell us what is the way to think about progress in our society, got a bunch of things wrong. When I think about the homeless problem, there was this boogeyman, and the word was sprawl. And for a decade of my life, the idea of Houston or Texas or all these places without urban planning that had sprawl was exactly how an urban planner and a very smart person would tell you not to do it. And I'm probably oversimplifying.
No, you're totally right about this.
So I do have to blame the very smart people for getting that wrong. Go ahead.
I recorded my podcast right before this, and literally made this exact point like an hour ago, which is Houston, that has basically no zoning, no permitting, no rules at all, has far more affordable housing and far less of a homeless problem and far more ability to support the homeless simply because it is not overladen with endless sort of rules that make affordable housing virtually impossible. Now, Houston's a weird place. You could have a 100-story tower next to a church, next to a strip club. And so, I get why urban planners don't like it. It's sort of, they don't like it because they don't have a role. There's literally urban planners are not welcome in Houston because they're like, we don't have plans. We just let people do what they want to do. But guess what that also does? It actually allows for affordable construction and affordable housing. And so, I think a lot of it, this is part of the problem. This is where Trump sort of, is both partly right and scores a lot of political points, which is the Democratic Party is so obsessed with showing how smart they are all the time, and that, we read Matt Iglesias every day, Derek Thompson and Ezra Klein and all of this stuff, that they can never see the forest for the trees, right? And they miss the underlying point time after time, and they will always prioritize being smart or being cheered on Twitter or Blue Sky Now and seen as progressive over actually speaking about things that actually matter to real people. And as a result, they fail both substantively and politically.
Yeah. And from what you know, is it an oversimplification to say sprawl turned out to be the solution to one of our hardest problems?
I was in Tokyo a little over a year ago. I remember it was at the top of a tall building looking out. And for as far as the eye could see were drab 12-story buildings, right, across the board. But guess what Tokyo also doesn't have? An affordable housing crisis. Now, people live in very small apartments. And you might live pretty far out.
There's very little population growth and little immigration as well.
Yeah, and you might live pretty far out from the city center. But again, they didn't make it hard to build, and it is a capitalist society. And as a result, they don't have that problem. So urban sprawl might sort of look bad, feel bad, whatever else, but ultimately people need places to live.
Yeah. So I would say to that, when the intelligentsia gets a narrative so wrong that winds up causing us such problems, it would be nice if there was some mechanism to re-examine that and to even say we got it wrong or here's how we do better next time. I don't know that the intelligentsia per se is given to that project, but I'd like to see it.
I would love to see it. And in my experience, they tend not to hold themselves particularly accountable.
Bradley Tusk, thank you.
Mike, thanks for having me.